说到2025年必要的沟通技巧，我们一定要来讨论如何让自己听起来更坚定、更有自信。Hello， 欢迎来到 Executive Plus 主管与沟通力的 Podcast。I'm Sherry, an educator, certified coach, and style enthusiast. 我相信专业有效的沟通是语言跟逻辑的完美结合。
And I'm Nick, a startup consultant, corporate trainer, and late-night gaming junkie. I believe great communication requires the right mindset and solid frameworks.
我们希望带给大家职场英语的技能、跨文化沟通技巧与其他能帮助您成为出色领导者的工具。
Join us each week as we share our experience, research, and methodologies to take your communication and language skills from good to great. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Executive Plus podcast. Last week, we talked about how to communicate in 2025, and specifically how to communicate when you can't really tell what's going on. There's either confusion, chaos, or the path seems unclear. So today, we want to talk about a technique in order to communicate with conviction, which means even when you're not 100% sure of what's happening, you can still bring confidence and you can still bring a sense of calm and structure to the way you talk.
2025年我们已经差不多过了1个月的时间，那我们在今年在这1个月已经也 witness 到了蛮多不同的事情 LA wildfires and TikTok being banned， 有很多人可以感受得到这种 uncertainty。 那我们上一次有讲到，就是在最这种不确定的时代的时候，我们该要有什么样子的沟通技巧。那这一次的单元我们就来讲到 How do you sound confident? Or how do you make yourself heard so that the people, the audience can value your confidence?
So as a foundation and a baseline, we're looking at a YouTube video created by communication coach Alexander Lyon. Now, he talks a lot about how to speak with conviction, and he does talk about communication skills for all professionals. He does cover a lot of how to do interview, how to get a job. And there are some things he says around the idea of communicating with conviction that we think applies in this situation. A lot of it is in how you carry your voice, how you structure your sentences, or how you even use body language in order to communicate more conviction.
那当然我觉得接下来可能讲到的一些重点并不是很全新的 idea， 你可能已经在很多地方听到，甚至在我们之前的 podcast 单元也都讲到过，但是我觉得这一些是值得一再被提醒的。 For example, how do you increase your vocal variety? We just don't think about that often. It's not something we intentionally do when we speak, but it does take practice. And once you actually focus on, okay, let me hear my voice, and you will notice that you have probably a very steady speed or a certain speed that you do, a certain volume, a certain pitch that you're used to. But here's the thing, increasing the variety helps you to be heard more clearly.
And to tag on to this, there's something he talks about in his video, but we weren't quite sure how to discuss it. Because he talks about volume, that when you're speaking with conviction, you should increase your volume by 10 to 20%. But that's something that's a little bit difficult to quantify. Like if someone speaks very quietly, is 20% enough? If someone in general speaks too loud, is this the correct pathway? But one thing around this idea and related to the variety that Sherry was just talking about is the idea of where you're speaking from. And what I mean by that is, okay, if you look at vocal coaching when it comes to singing, you have ideas of like a head voice and a chest voice, or the idea of someone singing from their diaphragm as opposed to singing from their head voice. And an easy way to think about this is For people who talk a lot and very quickly, but then you suddenly feel lightheaded or out of breath, that's because you're actually speaking from what we would call your head voice, which means you're not breathing deeply and you're not using your diaphragm or like speaking from your chest or stomach. You're speaking from your throat and head. But what you will find is that for speaking coaches, for singing coaches, or even from the idea of think about someone who has a very deep voice, where that voice comes from. It usually feels like it's rumbling out of their chest or rumbling from their stomach. To tie this all back, it just means that when you want to speak with conviction, the way you breathe or the place your voice comes from is a lot more deliberate. You're not yelling and screaming anger-wise, which is still usually your throat. You're usually trying to project, but in a way where it's like the way you breathe or where you feel your voice coming from is different.
那我觉得这边有一个小小的建议提供给大家。那因为其实通常啦，我觉得很多女生在说话的时候，我们的声音是比较小的，尤其可能在亚洲的环境，我觉得应该是一些 cultural background 啊等等的。Whatever it is, we usually have quieter voice. We need to turn up our volume a little bit more. 但是通常我们在可能就想到说 OK,We're too quiet. 那我要怎么样 increase my volume? 我们可能开始就会就像刚刚 Nick 所讲的 we use our head to speak. And this is when we tend to be out of breath. And so when I first started to do podcasts or even do training on stage, I was really forcing myself to speak louder. And I realized that I just basically went out of breath halfway through. And I didn't know how to breathe. So here's the thing.If you don't really understand how to increase your volume from your diaphragm, like if you've never taken a training, try this instead. Take a deep breath. Once you feel like your body can be more relaxed, your voice tend to come from your diaphragm and not from your head. 我觉得这个就是一个很基本的一个身体的一个反应。所以我觉得如果今天你可能没有办法去马上去找到一个 coach 好了，教你怎么样用肚子发音。但是当你可以比较 relax 的时候，其实你的声音它会来自一个比较自然的一个地方。And it tend to be your diaphragm. So give it a try.
This can help you, quote unquote, increase your volume, but more importantly, it comes across as a much stronger foundation because that relaxed part that Sherry just covered, actually part of speaking with conviction is speaking slower. Some people think like when I need to get my message across, I'm going to speak as quickly as possible to get all the information packed in there. But when you watch really good speakers or even really good YouTubers, their pace is actually slower. When you feel like someone is really coming across with knowledge or understanding, again, that conviction, they tend to come across a little slower and more relaxed. So part of this is also relaxing yourself can help you speak from the right place, but also feel like you have more conviction.
Now, the next thing about your vocal variety would be the pace. 那这个部分我觉得一定要强调，我们今天如果要听起来更有自信、更坚定 ，you must speak slower.Not faster. 那如果你平常讲话的速度呢，就是稍微比较快的人，这个可能稍微有一点点的困难。但你要知道，很多人当你的 audience 在听、在 consume 你所讲的一些内容的时候，其实他们是需要一些时间去 process. So I find this a lot is that when someone wanting to pack a lot of information instead of extending the time or instead of thinking about how to rephrase that, they tend to just speak it way faster so then they can pack in all the information within that certain amount of time.
A way to go about this is your general pace of speaking might be faster, but when you slow down, it's going to come to emphasizing points. So think of a TED Talk, right? Basics of a TED Talk. Today, I want to cover 3 things with you. 1, blah, 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 blah. 2. So what happens is when they're outlining something, it may be at a regular speed, right? I'm covering information, or I'm covering what you need to know. But the moment that something important comes up, they pause and slow down, which means that this is something that you can think of in terms of that variety and pacing, but that the emphasis on an idea comes at the slow part, not by packing more information around it. Anyone who feels like they should give you more information and they jumble it together really quickly, they're actually de-emphasizing their point, because now the listener has to parse out what they're talking about, as opposed to when someone's like, listen, there are 3 things I need you to do today. 1, this. 2, this. 3, this. As opposed to someone's like, there's 3 things I need you to do. First is you need to go do this, and second you need to do that. That's overwhelming and less likely to be heard, as opposed to someone who's like, very simple, 3 things. 1, number 1. 2, number 2.
And the third thing I wanted to talk about would be the pitch. Now, when it comes to the pitch, I can speak for myself and a lot of women, is that we tend to have higher pitch. But for me, I do have a lower pitch when it comes to women's voice. Now, pitch is something that's just natural. Sometimes some people have really high pitch. Some people have very low pitch. I mean, you can go to a coach and learn how to have a different register. But this is something that you don't actually need to think too much about, as long as you can practice the other aspect that we talked about, the volume, the pace, and even the pause that we're going to talk about later. As long as you can navigate the other part of vocal variety, I think it is totally fine to be your natural self.
And what you do find is something we covered earlier. If you slow down, even your natural self will slightly lower in pitch. The faster you go, the higher in pitch you tend to be, because you're just speeding words out. So part of pitch can just be handled not necessarily through practice, but just by slowing down. One other point that got covered was the idea of pauses. I talked about that a little bit before when I talked about slowing down and emphasizing. But pausing and letting an idea sink in, or pausing before your main point, is also really important as part of conviction. I've recently been rewatching Friends, and there's actually a scene where they make fun of Ross for this, where they're giving people a hard time about their habits, and that Ross speaks correctly, but Ross emphasizes words too much. So I think at one point Chandler makes a joke of like, oh, you do you? And then Ross is like, there's nothing wrong with speaking correctly. And they give him a hard time about both the pacing but the emphasis, but that he pauses a lot. Like when he wants to make a point, he does it constantly, where he'll like say a sentence really quick and then he'll just pause and then he'll say his point. And actually for speaking publicly, this is really effective. And if you were to watch a TV show and learn a way of speaking that's very effective in the real world, Ross is actually the person to pay attention to in Friends. His way of speaking is the most effective when it comes to coming across intelligent or to be heard well. And that's part of his character, right? He's supposed to have a PhD on dinosaurs, but he's supposed to come across as very academic. So his pace and way of speaking and making emphasis is actually very effective.
Now, another thing that was mentioned by this coach is actually the use of hand gesture. And they mentioned that using hand gesture can actually help you to kind of have this more variety when it comes to your vocal. When it comes to hand gesture, I have to say this, and I'm a victim myself, is that you could actually do too much and it becomes a distraction. I don't know if any one of you guys watched Modern Family. Cam is one of my favorite characters. And because in the character, he plays someone who's very flamboyant. So he has so much hand gesture, like he couldn't calm down. So his partner will often have to like put his hand down. So then he will like put it on his lap and not move his hand. So this is the thing. You just naturally like to use your hand. You sometimes may be doing it too much. One thing that you could do is actually video yourself talking. And it's going to be painful, but you get to see just what you're doing with your hands, because too much of it, it's not helping. It's actually really distracting on stage, and people, all they notice is you waving your hand. too much. So I think this is a really good exercise.
Yes. Hand gestures, when used properly, can be something that emphasizes what you do, but there's a balance between conviction and frantic, right? Like, also, if someone is very excited or very passionate, they'll use their hands way too much. You want to lean more towards the hands are there to emphasize what you're saying, but not overtake what you're saying.
Yeah.
Another key point that he makes in the video is a play off of two ideas already covered, pausing and slowing down. And it's the idea of emphasizing the important word in each sentence, which means when you decide to slow down or when you decide to pause, there's several different factors. But the easiest factor just to consider is that what is it that I want to emphasize? The example I gave earlier is if I made a list, I may say there are 3 important things that I want to cover with you. 1, example. 2, example. I'm emphasizing each of these numbers in a list. But if I just wanted to cover something as like, the most important thing that we need to think about today is priorities. Or I could put that in a different place in the sentence. I really think that our priorities are what we need to cover in this meeting. It doesn't matter where I'm placing the word priority. I'm going to slow down and emphasize that word and potentially pause either before or after it just to let it sink in.
Another thing that you could do to emphasize the word of the sentence is by elongating the sound. So let's say at the very end of your talk, you wanted to talk about this one single thing. So you can actually say is, at the end of my talk, I would love to emphasize this one single point. So what you can do there and what I've done is actually elongate the sound. So by elongating it, you actually change the pace of the speech. You're also putting pauses in front and you're giving people that variety.
And the idea of elongating the word can go hand in hand with pausing. It can also just be a way of emphasizing without slowing down your pace. Another technique that really helps create a sense of emphasis without necessarily pausing or moving around things is the idea of having a downward tone, especially on the last 3 words of a sentence. Anyone who has taken basic English classes probably knows that we use questions in an upward tone. Like, what? But when you use a downward tone, it comes across as more factual or, in this case, with conviction. So if the last 3 words of your sentence are used in a downward tone, it comes across quite finalized. Now, this can be an advantage or a disadvantage. If you are speaking with conviction or you feel you're really making a point, you want to have this downward tone. However, if you are an authority figure who wants to create conversation among people, even if you're like, I would really like everyone to contribute, that doesn't seem very welcoming for like, hey, give me your ideas, right? It's like, I'd really like everyone to contribute after this. That's different than I'd really like everyone to contribute. One feels quite finalized. The other one feels like it's more open. However, when we're talking about this idea of conviction, even if you have a question in your own mind, but you really want to emphasize that you are going to believe in this point. Like, I'm not really sure what's going to happen next, but I really do think we can work on it together. That feels more conviction than I really don't know what's going on next, but I think we can work on it together. One of these comes across as, I'm not sure, and I am telling you it's okay, but it doesn't sound okay, versus I'm telling you I'm not sure, but it's going to be okay.
所以刚刚 Nick 所讲到就是一个 downward tone 跟 upward tone 的一个不一样的地方。那如果我们想要 emphasize 就是一个句子的最后3个字呢，其实我觉得如果你注意到的话，你仔细听我们的 podcast， 你会发现 Nick 在讲话的时候，尤其是在做一个 ending 的时候，他其实这个已经是对他来讲是很自然的了。So if I'm just using that sentence again, like emphasize on the last 3 words of the sentence with a downward tone. 那你要怎么 emphasize 最后3个字呢？又加上一个 downward tone. So this is how you do it. Emphasize on the last 3 words of the sentence with a downward tone.
One final point that the communication coach makes in the video is the idea of eye contact. especially in a situation where you want to maintain conviction or you want to create confidence in other people. Eye contact is incredibly important. And most people talk about eye contact in terms of when you are speaking, you should be looking at people in the eyes. But what they forget to cover is that even when you're not speaking, you need to maintain that eye contact. A lot of people, when they're making their own point, will have very strong eye contact, but the moment they're done speaking, they will start looking at something else. They'll start looking at their notes, or they'll get back to their computer. You immediately lose any of the traction that you created when you break eye contact that quickly, which means that you should maintain eye contact up until the point the next person starts speaking, and then continue the eye contact with that person. That makes them feel that you are part of the conversation. You are continuing the conversation together.
我觉得这个部分呢，我们常常可能会忘记，尤其是在做一些线上的会议的时候，因为当然我们线上会议我们要看的是那个点 right, that one dot on your laptop or maybe your phone, but you don't really think about, oh, do I maintain my eye contact once I'm done talking? 你可能就会你的视线就会移到你的 computer screen， 或者是你可能也想去let's move on， 就是 when I'm done, I'm done. I'm gonna move on. My eye contact will go somewhere else. 但是我觉得这个就是我自己也要提醒自己的，就是如果你不注意的话，它是有一点会让你等于说是减少你的 credibility. So if you maintain, just imagine this, if someone's talking to you and they maintain the eye contact even when they're done talking to you, you can still feel like they're watching you and they wanted to know how you responded to that, right? Now, if someone's talking to you and once they're done talking, they're looking at their phone again, then you lose that trust immediately. And it almost doesn't really matter what they have done before. It's like, oh, you're done. Now you don't want to pay attention to me. Like you can feel that distinction, right?
Yeah, even recently we've been in a few meetings with the head of a large company. And the head of a large company during the meeting has his sunglasses on and is constantly looking at his phone. Mm-hmm. And you can tell the people around him are trying to
get his attention.
Not even just get his attention, but when he says something like, okay, they're doing it because they feel like that's the big boss. But at the same time, it's like everyone in that room is losing respect for this person. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they'll do what he asks because he's quote unquote the big boss. But he comes across as just immature and childish. Mm-hmm. Be like, you're never going to take this person seriously. And if you put that person in a context of other large company leaders, you'd be like, yeah, that guy's a loser, right? And that just simply comes down because sunglasses on, there's no eye contact involved, there's no attention being paid. And then when he talks, he is trying to come across as like, I know what I'm talking about, but everyone's like, yeah, no, you're just really immature. Doesn't matter what position you have in the company, that eye contact and that simple feeling like you're paying attention makes a difference between someone's like, oh, I want to follow this leader, to how did that guy get this position? There's a big dichotomy around that. Well, we hope that you enjoyed this. As always, we will link the video itself inside the show notes so that you can take a look at these communication tips and tricks. If there's anything that you use to speak with conviction, let us know so that we can talk about it in a future video. We'll talk to you guys next time.
Bye.
Bye.
The Executive Plus podcast is a Presentality Group production, produced and hosted by Sherry Fang and Nick Howard. You can search us on Facebook, 主管英文 Executive Plus. You can also find us on Instagram, Communication R&D, and email us at sherry@epstyleplus.com.